could feel my legs moving. I was barefoot and I was walking. I can't tell you what I was walking on, nor where I was walking. Although I couldn't put my finger on it, it seemed like a familiar place. Like some place I've been before. I felt my hand feeling a tree. Its rough bark, cracked and old, was scraping against my soft, yet severely clammy hands. My hand ran over the bark, scraping my palms gently but not enough to do any damage or leave a mark. Next thing I knew, I was out of what I came to figure out, in my head, was the woods. I was now standing behind a tree watching a funeral. I spotted a coffin with its top part opened. Something was drawing me closer to the empty coffin that had one single person kneeling over it. He looked to be in his mid-40s, old enough to be my father. He had black hair and what looked like small spots of gray in it. His back was turned to me so I couldn't see much of him, just his body shape. Although I could strongly hear his soft weeps, for what I figured, was his lost loved one. I saw one of his hands holding over his eyes, or his mouth, I couldn't tell you for sure. I looked for his other hand and saw it over the edge of the opened part of the body box. His hand was holding onto small, marshmallow-looking, fingertips that were peering over the box's opened edge, as if the body was ready to jump out and scream surprise. I moved from my hiding place behind the tree and walked forward towards him. I studied the coffin as I approached the man. It was pure black, one of my favorite colors. It had a small dark blue ring around it for the edges of the box. The blue was so dark, if you weren't looking closely you couldn't tell it wasn't black. As I walked closer I saw small tiny details that were well hidden in the darkness of the coffin. It looked beautiful. I reached the man and gently but fastly put my hand on his shoulder, trying to show comfort. He didn't even acknowledge that a stranger had just touched him. It was almost like I was invisible to him. I peered down at the coffin to see just who this man was crying over. She had bright red hair, that was obviously not natural but dyed professionally. You could tell the dye wasn't fresh because her roots were peeking through at the start of her hair. Her roots were a light red-orange color that I didn't like. It reminded me too much of my natural hair color. I looked at her body type and found she was really big, not like huge but big. Let's just say she was big enough to be plus-sized or a 2XL size, maybe even a 3XL. There were small but dark freckles dusted along her whole face. She even had them on her lips. She had black glasses with a clear but cloudy right underneath. They were square-looking but rounded on the corners. She had polar bear earrings that were identical to my own that I had got while at the mall with my best friend Brianna. The man stopped crying beside me and I removed my hand off of him as he stood up. He sniffed and wiped the tears that were still falling from his face. He had a small beard that stopped at both sides of his mouth. The beard was mostly white because of the grayish hairs that it mostly contained. I studied his eyes and realized exactly who he was. I would know that face anywhere. He reached down towards the ground, his other hand still holding onto the female's fingers, and gently placed a snowball-looking flower on her mid-stomach on top of where her other hand laid. He placed her other hand over ever so gently, but not before staring at her and softly letting out a saddened sigh. I looked back at the girl and saw her eyes were open.